In one episode of Rick and Morty, Rick develops a love potion, and Morty tries to use this to win the affection of his crush, Jessica. This gets out of hand, and the general public is exposed to the potion. Everyone develops an irresistible attraction to Morty, and to fix this situation, which becomes life-threatening and is causing chaos, Rick develops an antidote and sprays this from his spaceship onto the people. This backfires, however, and everyone is transformed into these grotesque mutant things. So basically, at the end of the day, their world is ruined, and they simply travel to a parallel dimension that is identical in every respect, except none of this business with the love potion and its consequences happened. So they land in that parallel dimension, and as they land, they crush the parallel dimension counterparts of themselves. They bury those bodies in the backyard, assume their place, and the plot goes on. It's as if nothing happened. Morty lives with the guilt of knowing that he killed a counterpart of himself and also ruined his original world. His actual mother and father, his actual sister, are either mutants or dead in that other world. So he lives with the guilt, but it seems as if he gets off scot-free. So this raises the question philosophically of the relative importance of the fate of the world, quote unquote, and the fate of your soul. There is a kind of proverb to that effect, like, what good is it to gain the world if it means losing your soul? And it's an interesting thought experiment to deal with. If you had the choice of, on the one hand, damning the world in some absolute sense, damning your timeline, but experiencing heaven eternally yourself, and perhaps you undergo a memory wipe and you don't remember that you've made this decision, you don't have to live with the guilt, you're guaranteed eternal blessings. Do you go with that on the one hand, or on the other hand, do you choose to benefit your world, your timeline, and to bring about a heaven on earth? Meanwhile, you are consigned to eternal damnation and torture. If you think that it's best to maximize the utility of the most, then it seems as if you are kind of morally required to consign yourself to hell and save the world. But the logic of that kind of utilitarian decision only makes sense under the condition of certain kinds of cosmology. If you are a temporal atheist and you don't subscribe to any form of multiverse, then sure, that intuition that the fate of the world is more important than just my own individual fate makes sense. And we have that intuition. It makes sense that we have that intuition because organisms that care about their offspring, and by extension, the well-being of the environment that supports their offspring, those organisms proliferate, and the organisms that don't care about their progeny and the fate of their world, in a kind of lesser sense there, those organisms don't proliferate. Evolution doesn't reward this kind of hedonistic calculation that would lead someone to choose their individual heaven over the heaven of the world. However, if you subscribe to temporal B theory, eternalism, where you believe that past, present, and future exists eternally, no matter what, and if you subscribe to a many worlds interpretation, where all possible worlds are actual in one place or another, then there's really nothing that you can do to make a difference for the world in the abstract. Because all of it is going to happen one way or another, whether you are the cause of it or not. In that case, why wouldn't you try to maximize your individual benefit? Subject this kind of question to the logic of different, moral systems, different faiths, and see what you come out with. What does the Christian say about this? I mean, the logic of Christian salvation is, in one sense, kind of hedonistic and individual, right? They are looking to get into heaven themselves, and they're comfortable believing that the vast majority of humanity will be damned, will suffer eternally. They're okay believing that, and they are working to forward their own salvation. And yes, they want to save others as well, so that they can experience their fellowship in heaven, presumably, or just kind of the moral duty that they feel to lead other souls towards heaven, emulating Christ there. But the real carrot at the end of the day is that by doing this kind of evangelism and leading people to heaven, you're doing a good deed. Maybe that will be rewarded in some capacity, or bare minimum, in this kind of fatalistic Calvinist conception, knowing that you're doing good works might reassure you that you are among the elect. If we look at a Hindu interpretation, they accept many worlds, they accept reincarnation and karma, and so they wouldn't believe in this notion that there is a world, an objective world that really moves on when you die. No, your world is always inexorably tied to your perception and emanates out of your perceptual faculties at the end of the day. It's the idea of the world illusion. Not that the nature of that world illusion is arbitrary. It's not. There is a logic to it. There is a karma. And so what you do to the world does matter, but it's not the world independent of you as a subject that you're dealing with there. It is your world, which is inevitably psychically tied to you, which is inevitably a kind of representation of your own psyche. And so by benefiting the world, you are benefiting yourself, but the kind of proximate mechanism of that self-benefiting is karma and reincarnation. So you benefit the world so that the world that you move into is the kind of world that is benefited, so that you reap the benefits of that. So I don't think the Hindu position runs into that many difficulties here. But it does lean towards this idea that what happens to your soul is more important than what happens to the world, because an objective, independent world is a misconception in the first place. And if you buy that B theory of time, many worlds interpretation, any multiverse theory, you really have to be inclined towards that kind of moral calculus. Utilitarianism breaks down entirely in the face of the many worlds interpretation, because everything happens anyway, no matter what you do. So you might as well try to benefit yourself. The ontological status of the world is the real question there. If it's contingent on you, then these are really not two separate fates. The fate of the world and the fate of your soul. The fate of the world that you experience is inevitably tied to your soul. But the world that we think of as this constant, permanent, inevitable thing that is kind of impassive vis-a-vis our own will, that is just there as a brute fact regardless of what we do, that concept has to be questioned to deal with this kind of moral calculus. It makes sense that we have the intuition to look after the world in a broader sense, evolutionarily, but does it really matter? And when we are making decisions, like what we do politically, is it a good idea to commit injustice in the hopes of acquiring power to benefit the world, if that means the condemnation of our own soul? Because we take that injustice on board, karmically speaking, we are the one who's going to suffer the consequence of that injustice. Perhaps the world, in some sense, will be benefited. The scales even out one way or the other. That benefit goes somewhere. But when you commit injustice, you're taking it into your soul, and the world that you experience will reflect that injustice. So do we compromise and do things that we know aren't moral for the good of the nation? Some idea of a fixed, absolute, exterior thing that is just there as a brute fact. I think it's an important kind of moral calculus to think about. And you can't solve this question without settling matters of cosmology, ontology, and metaphysics. And, the way that you arrive at that answer to these questions itself will be relevant to this kind of decision making. So you kind of have to start with epistemology, I suppose. So at the end of the day, to get a good answer to these questions, you have to kind of dedicate yourself to philosophy, which ends up being the answer to a lot of questions. But are you willing to do that? Or would you rather double down on this basic intuition that you have, that there is a world out there, the fate of that thing matters, and I'm going to focus on the benefit to that thing? It could be that intuition is not grounded in an ultimate reality and is in some senses a trap. And by not setting your priorities straight, by not seeking virtue and wisdom and trying to live a good life yourself and improve your own soul, you might think that you're doing good for the world. You might think you're doing something important and that you don't have time for that philosophy stuff because, the force of history is bearing down on your nation. You might be making the wrong call there. It's very possible that you are. So, let me know what you think of these questions. What other angles could you take on this? And thank you guys for listening. If you want to join the Plato group, it's still open for new people, always open for new people. I'll leave my Skype in the description. We are on the Republic right now. We're having a good time with it. So I encourage people to get into that. There's a lot to it, and I'm constantly being inspired with new ways of thinking. Even though I've read all the dialogues before, there's much more in Platonism, and that seems like the direction that I'm headed in. That's the kind of field that I want to double down in and make more content about. But thank you guys for listening. God bless.